The summer heat clung to Harrow, Georgia, like a second skin, thick and unrelenting, curling up from the cracked pavement outside Joe's Diner in shimmering waves that blurred the edges of the world. The diner itself, squat and stubborn, stood as if it had been planted there by time its once white siding faded to the hue of old parchment. The red letters on its sign bled pale by decades of sun. Inside, the air was a shade cooler, but not kind-heavy, with the scent of hot grease-burnt coffee and the faint metallic tang of a mop bucket tucked behind the counter. A ceiling fan spun overhead, sluggish, creaking like it knew it was losing the fight. The place was a relic unchanged, because the people inside didn't demand change until today. Evelyn Carter pushed through the door with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The bell above gave a tired jingle more ritual than announcement, and she stepped inside her pace, deliberate, neither hurried nor slow. At 83, she carried herself with the precision of a woman who had learned early that presentation was armor. Her floral blouse was tucked neatly into a pressed gray skirt, her sensible shoes polished despite the dust outside. The Sunday hat she held, a soft cream with a single feather, rested carefully in her hands as she settled into a window booth. She didn't glance around, she didn't need to. People noticed her whether she invited it or not, their eyes tracing her with curiosity, suspicion, or rarely respect. Evelyn paid them no mind. She unfolded the menu, rested her hands in her lap, and waited as if for something more than lunch. Across the narrow aisle, in a booth that seemed too small for their egos, officers Jack Thornton and Nate Carver reclined with the ease of men who had never been unwelcome. Their badges glinted under the fluorescent lights, names stitched in sharp white thread: Thornton and Carver. Thornton, broad and heavy, leaned back with a careless sprawl, his voice brassy, slicing through the diner's hum. "Kid was mouthing off before I even got out the cruiser," he said, pausing to gulp iced tea. "Had him face down on the hood in 10 seconds flat. Shut him up quick." His laugh was a bark, sharp and unapologetic. Carver, leaner, younger, laughed too, but it came too fast, too high, like he was auditioning for approval. "That's nothing," he said, leaning forward. "Last week, I had this black lady, all prim tight skirt, clutching her purse like it was gold. Didn't like me searching her car, so I made her take her shoes off. Started bawling before I even checked the trunk." Their laughter mingled hollow, filling the space with a weight that pressed against the other diner's silence. Forks paused, mid-air heads stayed, low eyes fixed on plates. It was a ritual here, this pretending not hearing, not caring. Evelyn sat still, hands folded, the menu untouched. She listened, letting their words settle like stones in her chest. Her face betrayed no anger, no surprise. She had heard this before in different voices, different decades, on buses in Montgomery, in courtrooms in Atlanta, in the whispers of neighbors who learned to look away. She breathed deeply, once, then turned, not abruptly, but with the slow precision of a woman who had drawn lines in the sand her whole life. Her eyes met Thornton's, dark and steady, rooted in a calm that carried farther than shouting. "You should be ashamed of wearing those badges," she said, each word measured, deliberate. "They're not yours to disgrace." The diner stilled. Thornton's smirk froze, then faded, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. He wasn't used to interruption, least of all from an elderly black woman whose quiet dignity he mistook for fragility. Carver shifted, glancing at the counter, but Thornton leaned forward, his bulk crowding the booth. "Mind your business, ma'am," he said, voice clipped hollow. "This is my business," Evelyn replied, unflinching. "When you treat cruelty as a joke, you make it everybody's shame." Thornton's jaw tightened. He stood slow but heavy, his boots scuffing the tile as he stepped toward her booth. "Let's see some ID," he said, arms crossing. Evelyn didn't move. "I'm sitting in a diner," she said, plainly. Drinking water, minding my business, until you opened your mouth. That's enough, Thornton snapped. You're trespassing. I've been coming here for years, she said, voice even. You're not the law just because you say you are. The air cracked with tension. Thornton's hand shot out, seizing Evelyn's forearm, yanking her from the booth. Her purse fell, spilling a comb and a folded handkerchief. The glass of water tipped, sending a thin stream across the table. Diners froze, some gasped, others looked away, their silence a kind of complicity. Evelyn didn't resist, but her body stiffened, immovable, not by strength, but by will. Thornton's face darkened, his grip tightening. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, Evelyn said, eyes locked on his. I'm making it exactly as hard as it ought to be. He shoved her toward the door, cuffs snapping onto her wrists with a metallic click. Carver followed, reluctant, his hands twitching. The diner's bell jingled as they led her out the summer heat, swallowing her shadow on the sidewalk. Inside the precinct's holding cell, gray and peeling, Evelyn sat, hands folded, unshaken. She picked up the phone, dialed a number etched in memory, and spoke softly when the line connected. Malcolm, she said, her voice steady, carrying a note of steel beneath the calm. It's time, son. The Harrow police precinct crouched at the edge of town, a low brick building with the squat permanence of a bunker, its windows narrow and tinted, as if designed to keep secrets in and scrutiny out. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint chemical scent of floor wax. Officers moved with the casual rhythm of routine radios, crackling keyboards, clacking coffee cups balanced on cluttered desks. But beneath the surface, a current of unease stirred like the first ripple before a flood. Evelyn Carter's arrest had landed like a stone in still water, and the waves were spreading. Malcolm Carter stepped through the precinct doors at noon, the summer heat trailing him like a shadow. His black suit was crisp, untouched by the humidity, his DOJ badge gleaming at his belt with quiet authority. At 45, he carried the weight of his mother's legacy and his own battles, years of dismantling corrupt systems, case by case, town by town. His presence shifted the room before he spoke. Officers glanced up, then away, their chatter faltering. The desk sergeant, a wiry man with a graying mustache, stammered as Malcolm placed a leather folder on the counter, the DOJ emblem stark against the polished surface. Malcolm Carter, Department of Justice, he said, voice measured, unyielding. I'm here regarding the arrest of Evelyn Carter. Chief Raymond Holt emerged from his office, his uniform pressed, but his eyes wary, like a man who sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Agent Carter, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his cheeks. This is a small misunderstanding. Your mother caused a bit of a scene at Joe's diner. Refused to comply, got loud. Nothing serious. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. I'd like to see the arrest report, body cam footage, and incident logs. Now. Holt hesitated, then nodded to Sergeant Daniel Walsh, a stocky man with a permanent scowl who shuffled to a terminal. Malcolm followed, joined by Agent Laura Kim, a forensic analyst whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Her tablet was already open, syncing to the precinct's evidence server. As Walsh fumbled with the login, Kim's fingers flew across her screen, pulling metadata from the system's back end. Within minutes, she leaned toward Malcolm, her voice low. Body cam footage from Officer Thornton's unit was deleted at 11:47 a.m. today. Officer Carver's file is trimmed, starts after they entered the diner. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his tone remained even. Recover it. Holt shifted, his smile fading. I'm sure it's a glitch. We'll look into it. It's not a glitch, Malcolm said, turning to face him. It's a cover-up. And it's not the first. Across the room, Officer Nate Carver stood near the coffee machine, his hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. Thornton, leaning against a wall, caught his gaze and smirked a silent command. Stay quiet. Carver's throat bobbed, his fingers twitching. He'd seen Thornton shove Evelyn into that booth, heard the crack of her shoulder against the wood, watched her walk to the cruiser with cuffs biting her wrists. The memory gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't ignore. Outside, the town was stirring. Joe's diner, just a mile away, buzzed with whispers. Tom Ramsey, the owner, stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot for the 10th time, his apron streaked with flour. He'd watched Thornton drag Evelyn out, heard the threat to shut his place down if he spoke up. Shame burned in his chest. When two young reporters from the Harrow Gazette slipped into a booth, their notebooks open, Tom couldn't stay silent. She didn't do nothing wrong, he said, voice low but firm. Told 'em they ought to be ashamed, that's all. Thornton cuffed her like she was a criminal. Ain't right. By dusk, the story hit the wires. A grainy photo of Evelyn in cuffs, snapped by a patron's phone, spread across social media, tagged Chuck Harrow Injustice. The precinct's parking lot, once empty, save for patrol cars, began to fill. A dozen residents, at first, then 30, then more, their faces grim, holding signs scrawled with marker "Justice for Evelyn." Stop the lies. A teenager with a megaphone chanted, "No more silence." The crowd's rhythm grew a pulse that shook the precinct's walls. Inside, Malcolm stood before a monitor as Kim played the recovered footage. The diner's security feed, untouched by Thornton's tampering, showed it all. Evelyn's calm rebuke. Thornton's aggressive lunge, the cuffs snapping on too tight. Her voice, steady and clear, echoed through the precinct's silence. "You're not the law just because you say you are." Malcolm's fists clenched, but his face remained stone. He turned to Holt, whose eyes darted to Walsh, then the floor. "This isn't a misunderstanding," Malcolm said, voice like a blade. "It's a pattern, and I'm tearing it apart." Walsh stepped forward, his scowl deepening. "You're escalating this, agent. Small town, small problems. No need for the feds to make a circus." Malcolm met his gaze unflinching. "You made it a circus when you let your officers target black folks and call it policing. My mother's not the first, but she'll be the last you bury." The crowd outside swelled their chants, now a roar. Thornton smirked from his corner, but Carver's hands shook his eyes on the monitor where Evelyn's dignity burned brighter than any badge. The storm had broken, and Harrow would never be the same. The Harrow police precinct had become a pressure cooker, its brick walls no longer a shield, but a trap holding in the weight of truths too long buried. By the second day of the federal lockdown, the air inside buzzed with a new kind of energy, sharp electric, like the hum of a wire about to snap. Agents moved through the halls with clinical precision, their laptops and evidence bags transforming the bullpen into a war room. The officers, once lords of this domain, now shifted uneasily, their boots scuffing the tile as if the floor itself might betray them. Outside, the crowd had doubled their chants. Justice for Evelyn. No more lies seeping through the windows, a relentless tide against the precinct's silence. Malcolm Carter stood at the center of it, all his dark suit, a stark contrast to the chaos, his eyes scanning a stack of printouts Agent Laura Kim had just handed him. Her voice, low and precise, cut through the hum of printers. 2 years of arrest logs, she said, tapping the pages. Over 60% of citations for resisting or disturbing the peace targeted black residents. Thornton's name is on half. Timestamps were altered footage flagged as corrupted when it wasn't. This isn't one bad arrest, it's a blueprint. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. Cross-reference with complaint logs. I want names, dates, outcomes. Kim nodded, already turning back to her terminal, where folder trees bloomed with damning data. Across the room, Officer Jack Thornton leaned against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, his smirk, a thin veneer over something darker, anger, maybe fear. He caught Officer Nate Carver's eye, nodding slightly, a silent order to hold the line. Carver, seated at a desk, stared at his hands, the knuckles white. The memory of Evelyn's arrest played in his mind like a loop. Her calm rebuke, Thornton's shove the cuffs, the diner's frozen faces. He'd filed the report, parroted Thornton's lies, but each word had burned a betrayal of the badge he'd once thought meant something. Carver's breaking point had come the night before, alone in the precinct's evidence room, the clock ticking past midnight. He'd typed a letter on an unmarked terminal detailing Thornton's abuses, unlogged stops, racial slurs laughed off in the locker room footage, deleted with a wink. He'd sent it to a DOJ tip line, masking his ID, thinking it might ease the guilt clawing his chest. He hadn't known it would reach Malcolm's team so fast. Now, as Agent Samuel Reed, a tall investigator with a disarming calm, interviewed a records clerk nearby, Carver felt the walls closing in. Thornton approached his steps, heavy voice low with venom. "Don't forget who's got your back, Nate," he said, leaning close. "You fold now, you're done in this town." Carver's eyes flicked up, raw and unsteady. "Maybe we shouldn't have done it, Jack." She was just sitting there. Thornton's smirk vanished, his hand slamming the desk. "You want to play hero? After all I've done for you." Heads turned, but Thornton didn't care. "Keep your mouth shut, or you'll wish you had." The precinct wasn't the only place cracking open. That evening, Harrow's community hall, a faded brick building with sagging rafters, was packed to the walls. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of anger, grief, and resolve. Evelyn Carter, released on bail, entered quietly, her cream hat still pristine. She declined a seat at the front, standing by the back wall, her presence a quiet thunder. The room hushed as she nodded to the organizer, a local pastor who opened the floor. One by one they spoke. A mechanic described his son cited twice for loitering outside their own garage. A nurse recounted being stopped for suspicious behavior while walking home, her scrubs still on. A teenager voice, trembling, held up a photo of her cousin, arrested and released without charges, now too scared to leave the house. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of systemic racism that stretched back years, Thornton's name a recurring stitch. Evelyn listened, her hands clasped, her eyes fierce with recognition. She'd marched in Birmingham, faced dogs in Selma. This was the same fight, just a different street. Malcolm, standing near the door, watched the crowd's anger harden into purpose. He'd met with Carver earlier, sensing the younger officer's fracture. "You know what's coming," Malcolm had said. Voice low. "You can stand with the truth, or drown with the lies." Carver hadn't answered, but his silence spoke volumes. Back at the precinct, past midnight, Carver sat alone at a terminal, the screen's glow casting shadows on his face. His fingers hovered over the keys, then began to type, deleting Thornton's phrases, aggressive, non-compliant, from the arrest report. He added the truth. Evelyn's calm, Thornton's shove, his own failure to act. Kim's system logged every keystroke, her tablet pinging softly in the next room. Carver didn't know he was being watched, but he didn't care. The letter had been a whisper. This was a shout. As he hit save, his hands shook not with fear, but with the weight of what he'd done. Thornton's shadow loomed in his mind, but so did Evelyn's voice, steady and unyielding. The precinct was quiet, but the betrayal within its walls had just changed everything. The federal courtroom in Atlanta was a world away from Harrow's dusty streets, its polished oak benches and high ceilings a stark contrast to the precinct's peeling walls. Yet the air here carried the same weight, heavy with the promise of truth and the threat of consequence. By the third week of the civil suit against officers Jack Thornton, Sergeant Daniel Walsh, and Chief Raymond Holt, the room had become a crucible, burning away excuses until only facts remained. Spectators packed the gallery, Harrow residents, reporters, activists, their faces taut with expectation. Outside protests had swelled, spilling across the city's sidewalks, signs now bearing not just Evelyn's name, but others: justice for Marcus, for Lena, for us all. The chant was a heartbeat pulsing through the glass doors. Malcolm Carter stood at the plaintiff's table, his dark suit as sharp as ever, but the lines around his eyes deeper etched by sleepless nights and the weight of his mother's fight. Across from him, the defense team shuffled papers, their confidence fraying. Thornton sat rigid, his jaw-set eyes fixed on the wall, as if he could will the room to forget him. Walsh slouched beside him, looked smaller, his scowl replaced by a nervous twitch. Holt, in a suit instead of his uniform, stared at his hands, the absence of his badge a wound he couldn't hide. The jury, 12 faces reflecting Atlanta's diversity, watched with quiet intensity, their notebooks filled with weeks of damning evidence. Agent Laura Kim took the stand, first, her voice clinical but unyielding. She presented her audit: 200 pages of manipulated arrest logs, deleted body cam files, and unlogged complaints, all targeting black residents. Officer Thornton's name appears on 63% of falsified reports, she said, sliding a chart across the table. The precinct's leadership, Walsh and Holt, signed off without review. This wasn't negligence, it was policy. The defense objected, claiming clerical errors, but the judge's sharp gavel silenced them. Kim's data was ironclad, time-stamped, and backed by digital forensics. Then came Nate Carver, pale and hollow-eyed, his uniform traded for a cheap suit. Under a plea deal, he'd agreed to testify, his voice trembling but clear. Thornton told us to clean reports, he said, eyes on the floor. Said black kids needed to learn respect, that we were doing the town a favor. He'd laugh about it, how he'd make 'em cry, make 'em scared to talk back. The courtroom stilled the air thick with disgust. Carver's gaze flicked to Thornton, who stared back, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold fury. I went along, Carver admitted, voice breaking. I filed lies. I watched him shove Mrs. Carter and did nothing. I'm sorry. The jury's faces hardened, their pens scratching faster. Evelyn Carter's testimony was the day's heart. She walked to the stand with the same deliberate grace she'd carried into Joe's diner, her cream hat resting in her lap. At 83, her voice was soft but resonant, each word a stone dropped into deep water. I was 13 when I was told to move to the back of a bus. She began, eyes on the jury. I was 20 when I marched in Birmingham, 30 when I taught in a school with no books for black children. I've faced men like Thornton my whole life, men who think a badge makes them right. She paused, her gaze steady. I spoke up in that diner not because I was brave, but because silence is a chain I broke long ago. They cuffed me for it, but they can't cuff the truth. The gallery exhaled, some wiping tears, others nodding. Malcolm watched his mother, pride and pain tightening his chest. The defense attorney's cross-examination was gentle, almost apologetic, asking if she'd raised her voice. I didn't need to, Evelyn said, unflinching. Truth doesn't shout. It stands. The lawyer sat down, defeated. Malcolm's closing argument was the crescendo. He rose, stepping to the center of the room, his presence commanding silence. This case isn't just about my mother, he began, voice low but piercing. It's about a system that let men like Thornton target black lives and call it duty. Evelyn Carter, who marched beside legends who survived segregation's cruelty, was arrested for speaking truth in a diner. They called her defiant, aggressive, a threat. But you've seen the footage. You've heard the lies they wrote to bury her. He turned to the jury, locking eyes with each. For 2 years, this precinct silenced voices, black voices through fear, through cuffs, through erased files. How many didn't have a son in the DOJ? How many are still waiting to be heard? He stepped closer, his voice rising not in anger, but in resolve. Justice isn't just a verdict. It's naming what happened, saying aloud that this was no error, but a deliberate offense against dignity, against equality. You have the power to say it. Systemic racism thrived in Harrow, and it stops here. He paused, letting the words settle. Respect my mother's stand. Respect the truth. Make sure this never happens again. As Malcolm sat, the courtroom held its breath, the silence sacred. Evelyn in the front row met his eyes, her nod small but fierce. Outside, the chants grew louder, a city waiting for the gavel's fall. The Atlanta federal courtroom was a sea of held breath as the jury filed back in their faces, unreadable under the harsh fluorescent lights. The gallery, packed with Harrow's residents, reporters, and activists, leaned forward, the air thick with anticipation. Outside, the protests had quieted, as if the city itself was waiting. Malcolm Carter stood at the plaintiff's table, his posture erect, his dark suit a symbol of resolve. Beside him, Evelyn Carter sat in the front row, her cream hat resting in her lap, her hands folded with the same dignity that had carried her through a lifetime of battles. Officer Jack Thornton, Sergeant Daniel Walsh, and Chief Raymond Holt sat across the aisle, their defiance eroded. Thornton's smirk gone, Walsh's scowl hollow, Holt's eyes fixed on nothing. The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman with steady hands, rose. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," she said, voice clear. "Damages awarded $3 million in civil restitution." The courtroom exhaled a murmur of gasps, quiet sobs and nods rippling through the crowd. Evelyn closed her eyes, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement, as if a long-buried truth had finally surfaced. Malcolm met her gaze, his nod, a silent promise kept. The verdict wasn't just financial. It was a declaration. Evelyn's stand in Joe's diner had cracked open a system that thrived on silencing black voices. The fallout was relentless. The Department of Justice, armed with Agent Laura Kim's audit and Officer Nate Carver's testimony, moved with unyielding precision. Thornton's federal trial followed swiftly, his convictions piling up, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, falsification of records. The judge's voice was cold as he sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison, no parole. "Your badge was a weapon," he said, used to target the vulnerable. Thornton's lawyer sputtered, but the evidence, videos, logs, Carver's raw confession, was unshakable. Walsh, confronted with his own signatures on falsified reports, surrendered his badge before a federal ethics board, his pension frozen. Holt, stripped of his title, resigned days before a disciplinary hearing, slipping out of Harrow under a cloud of disgrace. The precinct itself, once a fortress of complicity, was dismantled. The DOJ ordered its closure, its brick walls now silent, its emblem pried from the door. A new community-led police unit took shape, staffed under federal oversight, its charter requiring resident input on training and complaints. The people who once feared those halls, black families, young men, stopped without cause. Women like Evelyn now sat on its advisory board, their voices no longer whispers, but votes. Harrow's streets, once tense with mistrust, began to breathe, though scars remained. Nate Carver, under his plea deal, received probation and community service, his badge revoked. He left Harrow quietly, his face haunted, but lighter, as if naming his guilt had loosened its grip. In his final affidavit he wrote, "I stood silent too long. Mrs. Carter showed me what courage looks like." The words, read aloud in court, lingered like a challenge to the town's conscience. Evelyn, true to her nature, declined the spotlight. Reporters camped outside her modest home, offering book deals and TV spots, but she waved them off with a polite smile. This wasn't for fame, she told a young journalist from the Harrow Gazette. It was for what's right. She returned to her routine's morning walks along the oak-lined streets, evenings with her books, her Sunday hat pressed and clean. Yet her story rippled beyond Harrow, sparking DOJ reviews in neighboring counties, new laws on body cam transparency, and a wave of community forums across Georgia. Her name became a quiet rallying cry, not shouted, but spoken with reverence. On a cool September evening, Evelyn and Malcolm sat on a bench in Harrow's town park, the air soft with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue. The park, once a place where black families tread carefully, now buzzed with children's laughter, neighbors mingling without fear. Malcolm, his suit jacket draped over the bench, looked out at the scene, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. Evelyn, in a simple cardigan, sipped tea from a thermos, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold. "You did it," Mama Malcolm said, voice low, warm. "You changed this town." Evelyn shook her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "We did it, son. You carried the fire I lit." She paused, her gaze steady. "I used to think dignity was staying quiet, holding your peace. But it's not. It's standing even when they try to make you small." Malcolm nodded, his hand resting lightly on hers. "And sometimes standing means drawing fire." "Good thing we come from fire," she said, her voice soft but fierce. The words hung between them, a shared truth forged in decades of struggle. Her marches, his courtrooms, their unyielding bond. As the stars began to prick the sky, Harrow felt different, not healed, but hopeful. The precinct's old shadow was gone, replaced by a fragile but growing light. Signs still appeared at rallies bearing Evelyn's name alongside others, a reminder that one woman's stand had carved a path. "We didn't just stand," Evelyn said, rising from the bench, her eyes bright. "We made room for others to walk." Malcolm stood beside her, their silhouettes framed against the dusk warriors of law and legacy. The town was theirs again, not because they'd won, but because they'd dared to speak.